The following is a presentation of VBR. Welcome, and thank you for joining us in our study of God's holy word.
Continuing in the video Bible readings of the book of Acts, we are picking up the storyline in Acts chapter 16 and verse 25. Previously in Acts chapter 16, verses 11 through 24, we had Paul, Silas, Timothy, and Luke traveling by ship from Troas to Macedonia. It was a relatively short overnight journey, and then after they arrived at the seaport on the coast of Macedonia, they had an overland trek of about 8 miles to bring the travelers to the leading city of that region, the Roman colony of Philippi. In verse 13, Acts chapter 16, the travelers went down to the riverside near the city looking for a place of prayer, and there they had found a group of women, one of them being a worshiper of God named Lydia. She and her household became the first Christians in Philippi, and she offered her home for the use of the preachers. Sometime later, when Paul cast a cultic spirit out of a slave girl, he and Silas were dragged into the agora, which is to say the marketplace. And though the ancient city of Philippi is in ruins, the location of the large municipal center where business was conducted has been excavated in modern times, and we can glimpse at least the ruins of the ancient grandeur of the place where Paul and Silas were mobbed and beaten, partly for being Jews and partly for casting out the demonic spirit. After being accused of being Jews who were teaching customs unlawful for Romans, they were sentenced by the local magistrates to be severely flogged and imprisoned, apparently with no opportunity to speak for themselves or offer any defense. They were handed over to the jailer with directions to keep them secure, and so were locked into the inner cell with their feet in stocks, bruised and bleeding and miserable. And so reading now in Acts chapter 16, verses 25 through 34. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken. And immediately all the doors were opened, and everyone's bonds were unfastened. When the jailer woke and saw that the prison doors were open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, supposing that the prisoners had escaped. But Paul cried out with a loud voice, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." And the jailer called for lights and rushed in. Trembling with fear, he fell down before Paul and Silas. Then he brought them out and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" And they said, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." And they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all who were in his house. And he took them the same hour of the night and washed their wounds, and he was baptized at once, he and all his family. Then he brought them up into his house and set food before them, and he rejoiced along with his entire household that he had believed in God. So about midnight, Paul and Silas had been singing and praying, singing hymns to God, and the prisoners that were there in the jail were listening to them, we're specifically told. And there was suddenly a great earthquake, shaking the foundations of the prison and setting everyone free, both loosing their bonds and opening the doors. So how do you suppose that Paul and Silas felt there in the inner cell with their feet fastened in stocks, having been beaten severely in the marketplace earlier in that day? In the middle of the night, stripped, humiliated, beaten, in pain. They had to be miserable, but they prayed aloud together, and they sang hymns to God together. And no doubt they found comfort and encouragement in their shared miserable circumstances by this interaction of praise and petition. As encouraged in James chapter 5, verse 13, any believer who's in trouble anytime, anywhere, whether alone or with others, can pray. And any believer can express joy in song, singing again, whether alone or in company with others who share a faith. There's no great harmonies. I don't know that Paul and Silas had particularly great voices or that the two of them were able to perform music in any particular standard. But they were able to pray together, able to sing together, able to encourage one another, and in the process, able to make a testimony to the other prisoners who were with them in that jail in Philippi. There's tremendous power in praying and singing, even for two men who had been beaten and locked away in a dark cell. And no doubt it was a very dark cell at midnight on that day. People were listening. Their testimony of faith in those dire circumstances had an impact on others in the jail. They were there unjustly, but rather than rail against the injustice, they prayed and sang hymns to God. And so there was a great earthquake. God responded to their prayers and their praise, as he has responded to his people distressed in many times and circumstances. The earthquake might remind us of God's descent to Sinai that had shaken the ground. And a major earthquake had accompanied the death of Jesus on the cross, and another earthquake occurred with the rolling away of the tombstone when Jesus rose from the dead. This earthquake at Philippi must have shaken not only the foundations of the prison, as Luke says, but the whole region. And it was a testimony of the Lord's approval of Saul, Paul, and Silas, and his disapproval of how they'd been treated. Remember how Peter was released from Herod's prison in Acts chapter 12 with direct angelic guidance and a method that left everything undisturbed? Those guards who had been keeping Peter in custody were executed after Herod had interviewed them. Now, this is a different script this night in the jail in Philippi, but the means of release that God chose for his messengers was a testimony to everyone in the jail, including the jailer. The rest of the story concerns the jailer and his family, but I can't help thinking there was a symbolic message to everyone there when everyone's bonds were unfastened. Who had set them free? What would it mean to really be set free? Verse 27, when the jailer awoke. So while Paul and Silas were singing and praying, he may have heard some of that, but he had gone to sleep there in his duty in the jail. He was awakened by the earthquake, no doubt, and the commotion of the doors opening and all of that. He drew his sword and was about to kill himself, supposing that he lost the prisoners, that the prisoners had escaped. But Paul cried with a loud voice, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." Now, the jailer could have expected the same outcome as the guards who had been watching Peter in Jerusalem. The same outcome under Roman law, that if a prisoner was lost, then the one who was charged with the prisoner would experience the penalty that had been assigned. And so the jailer may have anticipated that he would be put to death as a result of losing these prisoners, and he may have anticipated that it would not be a quick and easy death if that occurred. So the earthquake awakened the jailer, opened the doors, caused all of the bonds to come loose, and that seemed to tell the tale of a mass jailbreak. But Paul here showed that the Lord's character was very strong in him, that we are to love those who abuse us, those who persecute us, that we are to show mercy to the merciless. And so Paul loved one who would appear to be his enemy, and he urgently intervened to save the life of the man who had trussed his injured body in stocks in the inner cell. This guy, who was just doing his job, had certainly exacerbated the suffering of Paul and Silas by putting them in that dark inner cell and locking their feet in the stocks. But Paul cried out in a loud voice to save his life, even if it might result in continued incarceration. And the jailer called for lights and rushed in. And trembling with fear, he fell down before Paul and Silas. Remembering that this was happening around midnight, there were probably no lights at all in that inner cell where Paul and Silas had been praying and singing. And the jailer hurried. Though he'd been asleep when the earthquake jarred him awake, he knew that what was happening centered on those men who'd been locked away, the men who'd been praying and singing. So he fell down before Paul and Silas in fear and trembling. Luke doesn't tell us how they reacted to that. Did they react like Peter had in the house of Cornelius? In Acts chapter 10, verses 25 and 26, when Cornelius fell at the feet of Peter in worship, and Peter said, "I'm only a man like you, get up." Very likely it was a teaching moment that the preachers would not have overlooked. In verse 30, Acts chapter 16, verse 30, Then he, the jailer, brought them out and said, Sirs, what must I do to be saved? And they said, Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household. And they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all who were in his house. So he brought Paul and Silas out, apparently not just out of the inner cell, but out of the prison itself, and probably straight to his home, since we have mention of his household. He was mightily impressed with the messengers and the events of the evening, and rightly so. The jailer's trembling in fear led to the crucial question, what must I do to be saved? In Acts 2:37, those who believed the message proclaimed by Peter and the other apostles on Pentecost had asked, what shall we do? Later in Acts 8:36, the already persuaded Ethiopian eunuch had asked Philip a related question, what prevents me from being baptized? This man's question is more basic, as he'd heard only bits and pieces and doesn't yet even know the basic message of the gospel. The core answer to what must I do to be saved begins, as Paul said here, with believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved. But this man had to know who it was he was to believe in. He didn't know that yet. And he had to know why he should believe in him and what all of that meant. And so they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all who were in his house. That night, between midnight and morning, they spoke the word of the Lord to him and his house. Believe in the Lord Jesus was a succinct way, a conclusion that opened the dialogue to tell the jailer the gospel, which they proceeded to do. As with Lydia, whose household was mentioned as being baptized in verse 15, we don't know who all was in the jailer's household. Probably a wife, perhaps children, maybe other family members, perhaps servants, but apparently the household consisted of people able to hear and understand the word of the Lord and able to believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and be saved. In the account of Lydia, we were told that while they were speaking to her and to other women there at the riverside, the Lord opened her heart to receive the message. And I would have to say that in this instance, whereas we don't know how the Lord opened Lydia's heart to receive the message, we see that there was a process that made the jailer here ready to listen to what Paul and Silas had to say, inquisitive as to what kind of men these were and what kind of message they brought that had gotten them into trouble in the first place. The circumstances of the opened jail cells, the earthquake, the loosed bonds, all of that made him amenable to realize that these men had a critical message and a power behind them. Verse 33, Acts 16:33, he took them the same hour of the night and washed their wounds, and he was baptized at once, he and all his family. Then he brought them up to his house and set food before them, and he rejoiced along with his entire household that he had believed in God. This jailer had been trembling in fear at about midnight. He had asked, what must I do to be saved? And his question was answered initially with a brief statement and then with a fuller proclamation of the word of the Lord. He believed it. And I think that the order Luke gives us here in verse 33 is important. He was baptized at once, but even before he was baptized, he bathed the wounds of Paul and Silas. He had previously obeyed the ruling magistrates by locking these wounded men into stocks in the inner cell, but now he obeyed the call of God and became merciful. He obeyed the call of God to be merciful. He did so immediately. And then he and all his family, and actually the word family is not in the Greek text, it's inserted by the translators of the ESV. He and all his were baptized. Baptism was of immediate importance, but mercy to the injured evangelists was an urgent priority. A preacher named John Chrysostom observed about 1620 years ago that the jailer washed and was washed. He washed them for their stripes and was himself washed for his sins. Notice again in verse 34, whatever the household consisted of in terms of adults and children, the jailer and his whole household are described as believing in God. His household consisted of people who could hear the word of the Lord, understand it, and believe in God. Also notice that the first answer to what must I do to be saved had been believe in the Lord Jesus. And the final observation is that he and his household believed in God. Now the word order here in the ESV, if we notice the word order in the New King James Version or any number of other similar translations, and he rejoiced, having believed in God with all his household. The clear indication in the text, according to most translators, is that he and all his household believed. Of course, we've had other examples in Acts that the outcome of believing the Lord was rejoicing. A load had been lifted, a new life had begun, guilt had been assuaged. There is light and life and hope that hadn't been known before apart from Christ and without the Spirit. It's very likely that they went out to the riverside that night with torches in the dark to baptize this man with his household at once. And then, in good Christian hospitality, he took them back to his house to feed them, being full of joy. This man had been transformed. He was born again. Reading from Acts chapter 16, verses 35 through 40 from the ESV. But when it was day, the magistrates sent the police, saying, "Let those men go." And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, "The magistrates have sent to let you go. Therefore come out now and go in peace." But Paul said to them, "They have beaten us publicly, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into prison. And do they now throw us out secretly? No, let them come themselves and take us out." The police reported these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Roman citizens. So they came and apologized to them, and they took them out and asked them to leave the city. So they went out of the prison and visited Lydia, and when they had seen the brothers, they encouraged them and departed. So in verse 35, when it was day, the magistrates sent messengers, police as it's rendered in the ESV. The word here, the Greek word that's been rendered police or officers in some other versions, is a word that means a rod holder, an officer or a type of sergeant who attended to the magistrates of Roman cities and colonies and executed their decrees. It is said that they carried on their shoulders the Roman fasces, which was a bundle of rods with an axe in the middle, as the symbols of their authority and indication of the role that they had as enforcers of the law, which could have included administering punishment and scourging and perhaps even beheading, according to the Complete Word Study Bible Dictionary. The order from the magistrates was to free Paul and Silas. The message was relayed through the jailer, and it isn't clear to me exactly where Paul and Silas were when the officers came and told the jailer. Perhaps they were still guests at his home, since he relayed the orders. Perhaps his home was directly connected to the jail itself, or perhaps after eating as his guests and having been ministered to for their wounds, they may have returned to the jail, if not to the cell itself, to wait out the night until they were set free, not under lock and key at any rate. I think it seemed to the jailer that these orders were good news. Paul and Silas were free to go. So come out now and go in peace. However, Paul chose to make a point to the officers and the magistrates who had sent them. Paul said to them, "They have condemned us, they have beaten us publicly, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens and have thrown us into prison." So Paul responded to the officers, belatedly informing them that both he and Silas were Roman citizens. While Roman citizens might be beaten and imprisoned for crimes, they were not to be beaten publicly, and they were not to be beaten without a trial and a verdict. In the heat and noise of the violence and the accusations the day before, Paul and Silas had been beaten, partly because they were Jews, and largely because they were strangers, and because Paul had angered the slave owners by relieving the girl of the spirit that was speaking through her. There had been many occasions when the disciples were persecuted, including Paul himself in the stories of Acts up until this point. And this is the first time that the illegal violation of the rights of a Roman citizen were a factor in the circumstances. Paul generally did not entrust himself to human courts or make civil complaints of this kind. But as with the circumcision of Timothy in Acts 16:3, there were circumstances in this time and in this place. It wouldn't do to have the local Roman authorities get away with their abuse of Jews, of strangers, of Christians, with overt illegal behavior and injustice. I have no doubt that Paul was irritated by the injustice and violence he and Silas had personally been subjected to But I also think he was mindful of setting precedents for the future of the brethren there in Philippi, that the local governing authorities should be more mindful of the law and not just follow their own prejudices or act in the heat of the moment. Very likely, Paul was also concerned for the reputation of the preachers, which would also affect the reputation of the gospel. Himself, Silas, Timothy, Luke, they had enjoyed successful work in that community, and they didn't want to be seen as shady characters or lawbreakers. So consequently, Paul presented the officers a list of illegal abuses that he and Silas had suffered at the hands of the magistrates. And this was not a trifling matter. And he demanded that the magistrates come and personally escort them from their false imprisonment. And so in verse 38, the officers went back and reported these words to the magistrates, and that resulted in them being fearful because they themselves didn't want to be subject to penalties under Roman law for having violated the rights of Roman citizens. When they learned that in their haste to deal with the Jewish strangers they had seriously violated Roman law, they were alarmed. So they did what Paul asked, and perhaps they even did a little bit more, not only escorting them from the jail, but also apologizing to them. What happened next, though, may have been an unintended consequence. It isn't clear to me when the original message came that they could be set free and go their way. It isn't clear to me whether that meant they could have the freedom to move around town or whether they were being instructed from the get-go to leave Philippi. But certainly, after the magistrates came and spoke to them, they were asked to leave the city. The jailer had urged Paul and Silas to come out and go in peace. And again, it's not clear to me whether that would have meant to go away from Philippi or whether that would have meant to go around Philippi. But certainly, as a result of asserting their legal rights, Paul and Silas were persona non grata. They received an apology, but the magistrates wanted them out of town, and so they were asked to leave the city. In Acts chapter 16, verse 40, they went out of the prison and visited Lydia, and when they had seen the brothers, they encouraged them and departed. So at least 2 households of Christians were following the Lord by this time in the city of Philippi. And Paul and Silas visited them, and however many brethren they were, after some weeks of time in Philippi, they encouraged those brethren, at least the household of Lydia and the household of the jailer, and perhaps several others. And then Paul and Silas left. Now I want to notice, going back to Acts chapter 16 and verse 17, when Paul had his vision of the Macedonian man in Troas, Luke wrote that they concluded that the Lord wanted us to go to Philippi. Acts 16, verse 17, it was us. Luke was part of the company that went from Troas to Philippi. And now in 1640, as Paul and Silas are leaving Philippi, it is they. Four preachers came to Philippi: Paul, Silas, Luke, and Timothy. But only 2 preachers are reported as going on from Philippi to Thessalonica. Luke definitely remained in Philippi, and apparently Timothy also stayed in Philippi for a time. We don't have Luke included in the party again until Acts chapter 20, several years later when Paul visited the Macedonian churches. Considering the very positive letter that Paul wrote to the Philippian church with its elders and deacons a few years later, we can surmise that Luke continued work in Philippi and Macedonia and was very effective in nurturing the church there, at least the church in Philippi and perhaps other churches in Macedonia. Timothy, though, while he seems to have remained behind in Philippi, would later catch up with Paul and Silas. It's possible that he was one of the couriers who brought money from the church in Philippi to help Paul in Thessalonica, as is mentioned in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 16. Perhaps Timothy was traveling back and forth between Philippi and Thessalonica. In Acts chapter 17, verse 1, when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And again, this is now Paul and Silas traveling on, apparently just the 2 of them, from Philippi down the road to Thessalonica. And that's where we'll pick up the story in our next installment of the video Bible reading of the book of Acts.